hard as it seems to imagine, slavery and bondage still persist in the early part of the 21st century. Millions of people around the world still live in slave-like conditions of forced labour and sexual exploitation. People trafficking is one of the great human rights issues of our time. So what can we do to bring it to an end? I'm Fletcher and this is Edges. In the West, slavery was outlawed way back in the 1800s. But the modern scourge of people trafficking is no less a form of slavery than that endured by thousands of Africans and others at the hands of wealthy landowners and merchants 200 years ago. The UN defines people trafficking as the acquisition of human beings through force, fraud or deception for the purpose of exploiting them. That exploitation might take the form of pornography or prostitution, servitude, forced labour, or even the removal of bodily organs.
Human trafficking is a wide term referring to many different types of modern slavery. But what springs to mind when people think of it? And do they think the problem is getting worse? Well, I'm here in the south of England to find out. Excuse me, sir, can I just ask you what springs to mind when you think of human trafficking and whether you think the problem's on the increase?
I think it isn't on the increase. I normally associate it with vulnerable people coming into, or usually being brought into the country by people who are profiteering by their movement here.
Well, there's the story of the Chinese cockle pickers in Cumbria, agricultural workers in Lincolnshire and Herefordshire.
I've heard of sort of women from East Europe being brought over here to work in the sex industry, for instance.
It is happening, it is real, but people may not be very much aware of it.
I'm sure it must be, yeah, but I don't know a great deal about it, to be honest with you.
Not maybe here in London.
You see it on the news when there's a police raid somewhere, but very often a lot of it goes undetected, unseen.
It's probably more of a problem than people realise. I think it tends to probably get hidden under the carpet.
I know it is an issue, I don't know how big it is.
It's a big problem here in this country. I mean, you can know from just reading the newspapers that you've got the trafficking in all the people. Yeah, it's a big problem, they need to sort it out.
Most people I've spoken to today say that when they think of human trafficking, they think of vulnerable girls being brought over and being forced to work in the sex industry. Everybody said they knew that it existed, they'd read all the newspaper articles, but it was hard to know to what extent because the crime is so hidden.
People trafficking is one of the fastest growing areas of international crime today and one of the most lucrative. Worldwide, people traffickers can expect to bring in between $7 and $9 billion every year, with very little outlay at all. In fact, some crime syndicates are now switching their cargoes from drugs to human beings because the potential profits are so much higher. According to the UN, there may be as many as 4 million people trafficked every year worldwide. 70% of them will be female and 50% children. But it's difficult to be precise about the scale of the problem. And it's a curse that's affecting East and West alike. In Western Europe alone every year, more than 500,000 women are trafficked, while in India 200,000 Nepalese women are trafficked into prostitution. Victims of people trafficking normally come from developing nations. But trafficking is also a problem for countries like the US, where according to the Justice Department, as many as 200,000 American children might be in danger of being trafficked into the sex industry within their own country. The Council of Europe has identified trafficking as a problem here too. It says that trafficking's reached unprecedented levels, and it acknowledges that trafficking is really just a new form of slavery. So who are the groups that are most vulnerable to being trafficked? Well, most of the victims are women and children, some as young as 5. Both groups are targeted for prostitution and pornography. But teenage boys and men are sometimes targeted too, being trafficked into forced labour. Trafficking seems to flourish in societies that are going through or have just come out of long periods of conflict. In the Kosovo conflict, for example, young women and girls were snatched away by armed gangs or enticed out of refugee camps. And the modern Yugoslavia has become a major trafficking destination and a major transit point for European trafficking. Trafficking also increases where poor countries share borders with richer neighbours. Poor people look at the opportunities across the border and they're attracted by the false promises of the traffickers. And trafficking increases where countries are in transition from a central economy to a market economy, as has happened in parts of Eastern Europe. In that environment, the rule of law is often far from certain, and crimes often go unpunished.